Welcome to another Garage Time with Goody. Today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be changing out the CV axles in the front end of this 2014 3.6 liter all-wheel drive Dodge Journey. Well, let's get to it. The symptoms we've been facing in the Dodge Journey is every time we make a turn to the right or the left, we're hearing popping sounds, and also we're hearing some clunking noises. We're also feeling some binding when we go to take off. You're going to want to buy replacement CV axles. I will leave a link in the video description showing you where I purchased mine, but ultimately it is up to you where you want to purchase yours. If you purchase from the same place that I did, you will see there are two different part numbers here. You will see the first number at the top, the track number is CH-8118. A1 number is 60-3521. If you look this up and Google it, you will see this is to the front driver's side. So, in order for it not to get confused, I'm just going to take a marker and I'm just going to write FD on it for front driver. Now we come over here to the front passenger side and it is going to say track number CH-8116. The A1 number is 60-3522. And I'm going to write FP for front passenger. Now that is optional for you to do this. A reason you would want to do this is so that you don't get confused of which side goes where. But obviously, if you do these all the time, since each side looks physically different, you would be able to tell. But if you're a beginner, this will help you in not getting the two confused. First thing you want to do, you want to remove this center cap on this tire, and you just take a kind of smaller flathead screwdriver and then you just put it in there, and then you just pry outwards until the center cap pops right off, just like that. This is going to expose down here. This is the axle nut, and this is going to be a 32 millimeter or an 1 1/4 socket. Now if you want to, like I'm going to, go ahead and spray this down with a lubricant. I like to use liquid wrench, and I'm going to let that soak for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to loosen up this axle nut before I jack up the car. Okay, so I couldn't find any liquid wrench, but I found my second favorite PB Blaster, and no, I don't have any affiliates with them or anything like that. It's just what I prefer. I'm going to go ahead and spray some in there and get that good and soaked on that axle nut. I'm going to give it 10 minutes to saturate and penetrate that rust, and that way it'll be easier to take off that bolt. Okay, so what I'm going to do next, I'm going to take a cordless impact, and I'm going to take a 32 millimeter socket or a 1 1/4. I'm going to take the nut all the way off. I'm just going to loosen it up before I jack the car up. So after I get this loose, that's when I'm going to jack the car up. As you can see, this is loose now, and I'm not going to loosen it all the way up until I get the car jacked up and I get this tire off. But you do want to loosen the bolt before you jack the car up. Next, before I jack the car up, I'm going to take a 19 millimeter socket, and I'm going to loosen all of these lug nuts. I'm not going to take them all the way off. I'm just going to loosen them up. Next, I'm going to start jacking the car up. And I'm gonna get it about 2 inches off the ground. There's no really set measurement how far you have to get it off the ground. And then as a safety precaution, I'm going to put a jack stand underneath. And that way, in case the jack fails, the jack stand will still hold the car up. Could save your life. Now I'm gonna go ahead and take the lug nuts the rest of the way off. And then we're going to remove the tire. If your tire doesn't want to come off and it's stuck on there, then you can kick at 12, 6, 9, and 3, and it will come off. But in this case, it's just going to come right off of there. So I'm just going to take the tire off, and I'm going to set it out of the way. And now, once the tire is off, we have access to everything we need to get to continue changing out the CV axle. What I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to be removing these 13mm bolts that hold on the brake line or the hydraulic hose, whichever you may call it, because this is going to give me more room when I'm moving the caliper around, because the caliper is going to come off, and also the ABS line is going to be moved around too, just to give it more slack so it doesn't get in a bind or so they don't break. So I'm going to go ahead, take these 13mm bolts off. And remember, this bracket has a little metal tab and it goes on the front. If you need to, you can rewind this video and you can look at that as it comes off. I'm going to set that out of the way. Then there's one right below it, 13mm also. Okay, now I'm going to get a plastic pry tool, and there is a place that has this plastic holder that goes into the hub, and I'm just going to go ahead and pry that out and get it out of the way also. All right, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this plastic pry tool and I'm just going to put it in gently and wiggle it around. This right here is the whole brake caliper, and that's what I'm going to take off. We're not changing the brakes. Since we're not changing the brakes, we're just going to go ahead and take off the whole brake caliper. And there's going to be 2 bolts back here. Back here you can see the whole brake caliper. This is the caliper itself. And if you're going to change the brakes, you would take off this bolt and this bolt. But since we're taking the whole caliper off, back here, closer to the CV axle, this is the CV axle boot, you'll have this bolt and this bolt, and that will remove the whole caliper. And that's what I'm going to take off. All right, I'm taking the 2 21 bolts off. When you're taking off the last 21mm bolt, you want to hold on to the caliper because it could want to swing down on. It could want to swing down on you. You don't just want it to fall because it could damage the hydraulic hose here. And now what I'm going to do is set it here for a second, and I'm going to get a bungee cord, or you could have a hanger that you can hang the caliper from your struts. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to hang the caliper up and out of the way with a bungee cord. I'm going to connect it to this strut up here, so that way it will hang out of the way completely. Now that that's out of the way, we're going to go to the rotor. Now the rotor, yours may be seized in here, and if it is, you can take a hammer or a rubber mallet and hit in between these wheel studs. and just keep going around every one in between the wheel studs until your rotor breaks free. In my case, it hasn't been too long ago since this has been changed, so it's just going to come off pretty easily. I'm going to set that to the side. And now what we have, this is your wheel bearing. And I'm going to go ahead, and since the axle nut is loose from earlier, I'm just going to go ahead and take it the rest of the way off. Now here's where a lot of controversy is said, and you get different answers from different people. You see, this axle nut is going to be your old one. And a lot of people ask, can I reuse my old axle nut? Well, it is not recommended that you reuse your old axle nut because this has been under a load for a very long time, and it can stretch. The integrity of the bolt can become compromised. So if your replacement axles that you ordered comes with a replacement axle nut, use the new axle nut. And especially if you're doing it for someone else's car. But if you're in a pinch and you examine the axle nut and you're doing it for yourself and the axle nut looks okay, then personally I myself have used the old axle nut, but I don't recommend it. Once the axle nut comes off, what you do is you'll see there's a little indentation that you can put a punch in, and you can use this punch, hold it in place, and then gently hit it with a rubber mallet or a hammer. Take it like this. Give it a few whacks, and it's almost flush. See, you can push this back now. If you can push this axle shaft back freely like that, then it is not seized with the wheel hub and you're ready to proceed. What I'm going to show you is that you need to remove these two bolts that are connected to the strut. And these are 21 millimeter bolts, and on each side you're going to need a 21 millimeter wrench or socket. And in this case, I'm going to use a wrench. I'm going to use a wrench, and that way if it tries to push down, it's going to go up against the dust shield. I'm just going to hold this wrench in place, and if it becomes too great of a force, it will come down and this dust shield will hold it in place. After the 21 millimeter wrench, you're going to need a 21 millimeter socket. And as you can see, that starts to loosen that one up. And I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom here. Now, I didn't take these all the way out for a reason. What I'm going to do, adjust this nut to where it's flush, and then I'm just going to gently tap it until this bolt comes through on the other side. If that doesn't work, you can adjust the weight up and down with your hand. See, just like that, it's going to want to come loose. Remember, the threads of the bolt is always pointed toward the rear of the car, and the head of the bolt is pointed toward the front of the car. So I'm going to go ahead, take this bolt off, put the nut back on so it doesn't get lost. Now I have the second bolt out. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this forward. I'm going to make sure that that cable is out of the way. And as you can see, I can now move this freely. Each side is a little different. So I'm going to remove this splash shield so I can have easier access to inside of here. This is going to take a 10mm socket. On each side here. And then there is one plastic rivet down here that you can take out with the pry tool. And remember, you should always get backup rivets just in case a rivet will break on you. That one did not break. Then you can see the whole length of the CV axle right here. Now, since I already have the hub down like this, you can push slightly down on the wheel knuckle. And as long as you don't damage, you want to be careful not to damage the splines, but you can see that this comes right out now, and you will see that there's a washer. Now, if your new kit doesn't come with a washer, you will have to reuse your old one, and it just goes up against the housing of the CV axle like that. So I'm not going to lose that. And then you will see that this axle, it's a pretty bad shape. It just needs to be replaced. So now the next part can be kind of hard, but I have my own way of doing it, and I'm going to be showing you that. First of all, you will need a pry bar. I'm over here on the opposite side of the car, and I'm going to go ahead and use the jack and jack it up about an inch or two off the ground, just enough that the wheel can spin. And what that does on the other side, it will allow me to spin the CV axle, because I'm going to need to spin it with my method, a quarter turn at a time. And if that wheel is on the ground, you won't be able to spin the axle at all. It'll be locked up. So that is the reason, and me doing so, I'll go ahead and jack this up. Then put jack stands underneath there, and what you want to do to make sure everything is set up right, you'll make sure that wheel spins. If this wheel is able to spin, it's going to be able to spin on the other side. And then we're going to be ready to take this CV axle off. All right, what we're going to do next is right here. I have a pickle fork. They do make an official pulley for these, but you don't need one. I'm just going to use, like I said, I'm just going to use a plain pickle fork. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to try putting it up under here and prying against the outer part of the axle, and maybe even using a hammer to tap on it. If it doesn't want to come out, then what's going to happen is, since I jacked up the car on the other side, I'm able to turn this axle a quarter turn at a time, because what it is, there is a retainer pin in there. There is a retainer pin in there that's hanging down, and if it's not in the 12 o'clock position, it may have the axle locked in there, and it's going to be harder to come out. But once you get this axle in the 12 o'clock position and that retainer is in the exact position, it's going to hang down and let this come out a lot easier. So that is why I jacked up the other side of the car, so that the wheel can turn. So we're just going to try it quarter turn at a time. It doesn't look like it's going to come off easy there, so I'm going to turn it just a quarter of a turn and put it back up under there. I'm going to turn it again. Now this is still not easy peasy, but it is going to be a way that it's doable. It's a lot easier. Another quarter turn. Okay, I think I found the quarter turn, and I'm going to be tapping this. Now, if you can see that, this right here, it has let go. I should just be able to tap this out right here the rest of the way. This has come right out. And as you can see, this, if you can see how this ring has that space in between there, that space was up here at the 12 o'clock position, and then it hangs down, and then it allows it to unlock, and then you can just pull the axle out. So that's an easy tip that you can use to get these CV axles out without getting any special or proprietary tools. I'm about ready to install the passenger side CV axle, and I wanted to make sure that rubber O-ring that came off is pushed back here up against this wall around the seal, and also that this locking pin is in the space is in the 12 o'clock position. See, there's the space, and I'm going to put it in the 12 o'clock position, and if it's in the 12 o'clock position, you'll be able to see that right here it sags down a little bit, which will let the top clear the shaft, and it'll be able to lock in. It's not going to be wandering from the left or the right or up. So remember that with the locking ring. And then you'll line up the splines. And you'll feel it go. And then you'll push it back with a little bit of force. And then if it goes in, you'll be able to pull it like this, and it won't come back out no matter how hard you pull. That's all there is to that. The new CV axle came with a new axle nut, and like I said, we're definitely going to be using that new axle nut. I'm just going to be getting everything snugged down right now, and then once everything is in, I'm going to tighten them down according to specs. I'll be putting the torque specs in the video information, and I also will be putting them on the screen. Now remember that washer I said to make sure it goes on? Well, in the CV axle right here where it's flat, you'll want to put that washer back on. And then we're going to put the CV axle, back into the wheel hub and try to line up the splines. At first it's going to be a lot harder to adjust this CV axle if your old axle was worn out. If your old axle was worn out or messed up because the new ones don't turn as easy. So you might have to put some muscle into it and make sure that it's lined up with the splines as this one is right here. And then I'm just going to hand tighten the axle nut. Okay. Then I'm going to hold the wheel knuckle, make sure it clears the ABS wire and the hydraulic hose, and we're going to get those two big 21mm bolts. We're going to line it up with this metal bracket right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put these two 21mm bolts in, and I'm going to be tapping them on each side. I'm going to hammer it to where it grips with these threads right here at the very top of the head of the bolt. And you can adjust this wheel knuckle. And then I'm just going to tap them until it comes to the other side. Do the same with the top, and make sure that the hoses, the ABS and the hydraulic brake hose is out of the way. And then if it doesn't go, if it gets caught on one of the taps, just make sure that you wiggle the wheel knuckle. It may need to go back a little farther. In this case, it needed to go back a little farther. It should go right on in now, just like that. And then I'm going to move the brake caliper out of the way, and I'm going to hand tighten these 21mm nuts on here. Now I'm going to do the top one. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the cordless impact and I'm going to put a 21mm socket on there. And then I'm going to use the 21mm wrench, just like I did taking these off, so that the nut doesn't spin on the opposite side. And I'm going to tighten these bolts down snug, not torque spec yet, but just snug. Okay, that is snug. I'm going to go ahead and snug up the axle bolt. Now on some cars, on this axle shaft, there will be a hole for a cotter pin. A cotter pin is a pin that sticks down in here, and then you bend it back so it prevents the nut from coming off. A lot of vehicles don't have them. In this case, it doesn't have one, but that's just fine, as long as you torque it down to torque spec. On the strut mount bracket here, these two back 21mm bolts, you set your torque wrench to 65 foot-pounds, and you're going to be using a 21mm socket. What I did was I moved the caliper to the right side. If this caliper at any time is in your way, you can just move it over from left to right so that it's not in your way and you have access to these bolts. I've got the bottom torqued to 65 foot-pounds. Now I'm going to torque the top one. Okay, That one is torqued. Now we're going to be putting the rotor back on. And you'll also want to make sure when you get the rotor back on that your dust shield isn't bent in any way, that you didn't bend your dust shield, because if you do, it's going to be rubbing when you get it back together. If you can move it and you don't hear a rubbing sound, you're good. If you hear a rubbing sound, you might have bent your dust shield and you need to bend it back in place outward so that it doesn't touch your rotor. And it's going to be time to bolt these back. I don't really see the torque specs for these little hydraulic hose bracket, so I'm just going to get it snug and I'm not going to put it on there too tight. You'll see that there is a metal tab here, and this is a 13mm bolt, so you'll need a 13mm socket. That metal tab is going to go in this first hole right here. Then the one to the right has the threads. You put it up against there and you start that bolt by hand, and then you just snug it on there. You can do it with a socket or an impact wrench. Just don't tighten it down too hard. I'd imagine it would be like 8 foot-pounds or something of that nature, so not very much at all. Then we're going to take the other bracket, which is the ABS, and you'll see how this has a tab, metal indentation right here for this metal tab to go over top of it, and for the second 13mm bolt to fit right in there. And I'm going to go ahead, just like the other one, I'm going to start it by hand. And be careful, you don't want to cross thread anything. I will mention that too. And then that is on there. Next, I'm going to put this splash guard back on. There's going to be two 10mm bolts right here and another one right here. The metal tabs are going to go behind this plastic piece, and you can start them by hand. Again, I don't know the torque specs on these either, but most of the time they're around 7 to 8 foot-pounds, so use very little torque. Just snug these up. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to take an impact and barely snug them down. Good. And then it has the plastic rivet that there's going to be 3 holes right here. You line it up with the bottom, this bottom splash shield piece, the middle, and then the outer. I did tell you that I had replacement plastic rivets, and I do. This one by the splash shield also broke off, and I have spares. And I will put a link in the video description so you guys can buy replacements in case you're doing these jobs and just have them on hand when you need them. That is the wrong one. I can take that out when I say that. That is the wrong one. Okay, that is it. It's a little different, but I think it's one of the others. Wait, I know that's not them. It's like for the windshield. I don't think that's it either. And it pushes in. That's in tight. That's in good. Just keep some of those plastic replacement rivets on hand if you work on a lot of cars, or if you work on cars, or you're going to be working on your car, just keep some of those on hand, because it's inevitable that those plastic rivets or holders are going to break, because they're plastic, they're brittle, and they just don't last, especially depending on the environment you're in. Ready to put back on the caliper. And you're not going to need to adjust the brake piston or anything. Just make sure that the rotor is pushed back and that the brake pads fit in between the rotor as you put this on, and you line up the 2 back bolt holes. All right, once that is done, you will see the caliper is back on. The rotor is just fine. The dust shield is not bent, and we are ready to put the wheel back on. And then we're going to let the car down, and we're going to torque this axle nut to spec, which is 118 foot-pounds. Okay, now we're going to be ready for the tire. Now what I usually do is just put the tire up like this, and on each side I put my feet, and I lift it up with my feet, and I line it up to the lug nuts. And then I just simply get the lugs started by hand to make sure they don't cross thread. Like so. Then once I do get all of these on here, I'm going to just snug these up in a crisscross pattern. And then I'm gonna snug these up with a deep well 19mm socket and a crisscross pattern. Start down here, and I'm gonna do it in a crisscross pattern so that it pulls it back to the rotor and it will set up flush against it. Now next, what I'm going to do, I'm going to let the car down from the jack and the jack stand, and when it's setting on the ground, I'm going to go ahead and torque the axle nut to 118 foot-pounds, and I'm going to torque these lug nuts down also to 116 foot-pounds. The one last step you have to do, where I jacked up the car so that I could move the wheel on this side, and then in turn move that CV axle a quarter of a turn, I have to remove the jack stand that I lifted up the driver's side with, and that's the very last thing, and then we're going to be done. So there's the jack stand. I'm going to let the jack down. So I have my torque wrench torqued to 118 foot-pounds. I have a 32mm or a 1 1/4 socket. I'm going to put it over the axle nut. And right here, I don't know how strong you are, but if this is not enough torque for you, you can get a cheater pipe and put it over this. But I think I'll be able to do this just like this. Okay, it is on there at 118 foot-pounds. And I know what you're going to say. What happens if I put it on way too less or way too tight? Well, if you put it on too tight, it could wear out the axle a whole lot quicker than it should. If you put it on there too loose, it could, the axle nut could come off. So you want to get it within 10 pounds of the torque spec. Now all that's left to do is to put on the center hubcap. Here we go. And you just put it over there and just give it one little tap. and then it's back on. Thank you for joining me today for another Garage Time with Goody. This is how you replace the CV axle on the passenger side in a 2014, but I believe it works in the years from 2011 to the years 2019 Dodge Journeys. This is the all-wheel drive version, 3.6 liter engine. It has to be that version, but that is how it's done on the passenger side. If you like this video, please smash that like button. Consider subscribing to my channel. And until next time, I will see you later.